Hi guys, obviously I'm Nathan. Um, this is the React workshop. So today I'm going to be giving you a crash course on React. And that will include what React is, why you should learn it, and we'll also be jumping into a bunch of code and trying to develop our own React application together. By the way, while I'm presenting on this screen, I won't necessarily be able to open the chat, otherwise part of the screen will go blank. So just for this first section, I won't be able to read the chat, but if you have questions as we're going along in the presentation part, then I can read them at the end of that. But I definitely encourage you to still try and interact in the chat and ask questions so that I can answer them when I get there. Cool. So firstly, a little bit of background. I guess the main question would be, why am I teaching this workshop, or why am I doing this workshop? And that's probably an excellent question. But firstly, I'm a final year software engineering student, which means that, CESESoc is greater than CSESoc, I'm sorry. But a little bit about my background. I have a few years of experience doing front-end work. And my fascination with front-end applications, or the front-end side of applications, started with Comp 2041, which I'm currently tutoring. And that course originally introduced JavaScript at the end of the course about now. And after that, I had a stint at a few small startups where I was creating a chat messenger application using React. So that was my opportunity to do a summer project and learn a bit more about front-end technologies like React. I then moved on to Accenture for the second half of last year. So I was studying full-time and working full-time for Accenture, again, working in front-end, this time, not necessarily React, but some other front-end technologies. And there I was creating editable PowerPoints. So if you imagine you have PowerPoint application by Microsoft, and that was kind of integrated into the browser and dealing with a few different forms in order to generate a PowerPoint or a PDF. Then most recently, over the summer 2019 to 2020, before COVID, before we had all of these restrictions, I was at Canva making interactive word clouds. And what that means is that I was making a word cloud kind of component or visualization. And that word cloud would be used based on live audience Q&A responses. So someone is interacting with the presentation, they send in questions or answers, and they receive this visualization of a word cloud with pretty colors and all of that kind of stuff. Cool. So there's my little LinkedIn thing. There's a bit of confetti to celebrate what I've kind of achieved, but none of this is really about me. So that's probably, and you've heard enough about me for now. Cool. So why do I mention all of these projects? Well, there's a few reasons. And the first one is, I guess there's one question. What do all of these applications have in common? So there was kind of three main projects that I completed outside of university related to startups, related to other companies. One of them is a chat messenger. One of them was PowerPoint PDF style. And the third one is like this word cloud visualization. So what do all of these things have in common? Well, you probably guessed it already. It's not necessarily React, but they all did involve some form of front end. So what happens here? So the thing that we're learning about today is React, but like based on React is just one of the technologies that we could be using. So there's all kinds of front-end technologies, a bunch of other things as well along the way that I had to learn outside of React. And that might have included other technologies like Angular or Vue, HTML, CSS, which all go kind of hand in hand. And there's probably a bunch of other things along the way as well. So today we'll be kind of focusing on JavaScript, and also React, but we will include a bit of HTML or CSS to just help us build this application to make it look a little bit better. And we also need to know a little bit about it as we're going along. But don't worry if you haven't learned any of that, because we'll cover a lot of that along the way. What else do I have to say here? Yeah, so we'll be running through the basics of React. We'll be running through the basics of JavaScript. So JavaScript, there's this term which is called ES6, and ES6 is basically where we have this modern JavaScript standard. It's like the most recent version of JavaScript. Some people refer to it as ES6, but some of those things are useful because React is such a modern technology. There's also a bunch of other things that we could potentially run into. As you can see here, that we have like this whole bunch of like weird symbols and like fancy icons, and majority of these we don't necessarily need to know about, but they're all involved in, I guess, running a front end, all involved in building a front end application from scratch. Cool. So big question, what is React? React is simply a JavaScript library for creating user interfaces. And what that means is that React.js or React, it basically has loads of like nice modules, loads of packages that lets us interact with creating a front-end UI. And so what I mean by that is currently, React is the most popular front-end technology to build a front-end application from scratch. So if we compare the three most popular, we have React, we have Angular, and we have Vue. And you can see from the graph that React is, I guess, double the popularity of the next two, and that's just over the past year. So they're all kind of increasing in terms of their popularity, but there's also a bit of a learning curve for some of the more peculiar things about these languages. What else? So by the end of this workshop, you'll be able to create your own front-end application that can be used or applied to lots of scenarios, even though we're going to be focusing on kind of just one use case of what React could be built for. It's going to be a kind of a basic example, but hopefully the code or the things that we'll be including or writing are things that could apply to, for example, the hackathon this weekend, or just any side projects that you want to create really quickly, or that you want to make using a modern front-end technology. What else? Okay, so now firstly, let's take a step back. And before all of these fancy JavaScript frameworks like React or Angular, we had simply an index CSS, an index HTML, and maybe we have an index.js or a setup.js. And all of these things would form the basis of our application. But nowadays, we kind of know that software is a lot more complex than, say, 10, 20 years ago, when we would simply be using our CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. So let's take a step back, and maybe we'll go into a different context. I am going to open the chat here, but think about video games. So hopefully most of you would be familiar with this. So let's say Pac-Man was created in the 80s, I think, 70s or 80s. And Pac-Man, we had Super Mario Brothers or some other game for an NES after that. We also have things like Super Mario 64, or coming towards more modern stuff, we have Grand Theft Auto or maybe Valorant. I guess those are the more popular things. But the reason why we're kind of having this video games analogy is, how large do you think Pac-Man was? And how large do you think creating a fresh React project would be? So just in kilobytes or megabytes or gigabytes? Does anyone have any guesses? React is probably bigger. How large do you think Pac-Man was? 5 times? Okay, so 200 kilobytes, that's pretty close. So the answer for Pac-Man is that it was 24 kilobytes. So when you see Pac-Man in an arcade, or you've played it on some console, the disk, or that cartridge that you would plug in would only have 24 kilobytes, sorry. And if you wanted to play Super Mario Brothers, you know, with 3D textures, that would only take up 64 megabytes. So Super Mario 64, Nintendo 64, 64 megabytes. That's pretty easy to remember. How large do we think a React project is? So we had a suggestion that the React project was 5 times as big. So if Pac-Man was 24 kilobytes, what's that? Times 5. 120. 300 to 600 megabytes. That's quite the leap. So let's find out. So it's 185 megabytes. So Peter's pretty close there. But as you can imagine, we've gone from 24 kilobytes to 185 megabytes. So this is more than, 100,000 times bigger than Pac-Man was. And this is only in the stretch of, 30 odd years. The point of sharing this is that all of these projects or these front-end technologies are so much larger than we would expect. So even though it's generating, for example, things like a modules folder, we don't really care about file size anymore. Back then, it was a big consideration. Now it's not really a consideration. Instead, we're more after something which is more interactive, dynamic, and something that's a bit more beautiful than just the pixelated style of something like Pac-Man. Cool. So what do we need in order to create a React application? So a good place to start is a simple Google search. And a Google search will give us some Facebook documentation, which is create React app. So create React app is basically an application by Facebook. React is also created by Facebook. So create React app are separate things, but create React app is building a React application, as you can imagine. So we'll be using create React app a little bit later. However, you can see here that we have also these other things like Node and NPM, which we require in order to build create React app. So the technical details of Node go beyond the scope of this workshop, but essentially you can see here that JavaScript, or previously it was referred to as ECMA script, has existed since 1997. So JavaScript is probably one of the older languages that actually exist. And it was, of course, used for web development. So from the start, it was all about what we would call front end or client side, for example, rendering. And in that instance, we have, for example, JavaScript from 1997. You probably would have been using not even Internet Explorer, but things like Netscape or really, really old browsers. And it's been updated and updated. As you can see, there's like 4 versions in between there and 5. And now we've got like pretty much yearly versions of JavaScript being released. Why does this matter? So amongst all of this time, it was focused on web development. So what we would call the front end, you enter a browser, it will give you a visualization of a website, and there's usually some JavaScript involved in order to make things interactive, in order to, you click a button and it sends you to another page. You click a button and it adds for example, a slide to your presentation, something like that. However, there's also the other side. So we've got the front end side that involves some form of JavaScript. It always has. On the other side, we also need some form of a backend. So think about what happens on the backend side or the server side. We could use other languages that you've probably seen in other courses. For example, we could use C, or we could use C++ or something like Python. But the problem is we can't use C or Python to necessarily create a nice front-end UI that we could using JavaScript. So that is what Node is. So we come back to here, we need Node, we need NPM. What is Node? Node is simply an engine to run JavaScript in your local environment. So what does this mean? It means that we can write JavaScript and host our application on some server or some machine. In this case, if we run create React app on our own computer, that means that we're introducing Node as the server or the host of what we want our web browser to show. So actually, the reason why we need Node is Node needs access to lower level things. And what I mean by that is that it needs access to, for example, the file system to see what files you want to show on the website. And it needs access to, for example, the operating system and some other lower level things. Actually, at a technical level, although we won't be getting towards it, Node.js actually just compiles JavaScript, C++, and C together. So if you're familiar with C or C++, it's actually compiling a bunch of those things together. Because C++ or C are built for backend, it will actually compile all three of these languages together in order to run a server in the background. Cool. So we've covered what Node.js is, and we know that it's used to support the backend of our application. But does anyone know why we would use JavaScript for front-end applications in the first place? So why on earth would we use JavaScript? Is it the best language in the world? Why aren't we learning it at UNSW? Because the browser is designed to deal with it. Browsers support it. It's fast, popular. Yeah, so those are all really good answers. It's kind of a tricky question. So some of the answers where you're saying that it's fast or that browsers support it, those are all correct. But really, there's not really a technical reason behind it, which is why it's kind of a tricky question to ask. To look at it, we can see here, this is just a simple diagram from GitHub. And from GitHub, which GitHub is owned by Microsoft, and it basically says that JavaScript is the most popular language, and it's more popular than the next two popular languages, being Java and Python, even when they're put together. So, the two of these are like 1.5 million pull requests that involve Java or Python, and JavaScript still has 1.6 million. So JavaScript is evidently the most popular language, and it's the most popular language by a long stretch. There's also other languages like CSS. They're heavily linked to JavaScript, but they serve a different purpose. But what we see from here is, it's the most popular language, and 10 years, 20 years ago, JavaScript was nowhere near as popular as it is now. Why do you think JavaScript has become so popular over the last 20 years? And this is hopefully something which you should be able to recognize. Why do you think JavaScript has become more popular in the last 10, 20 years? JavaScript is because of apps? Yeah, so that's a really good answer. So I guess there's kind of this principle that applications like Facebook or Google, which we use on a daily basis, the internet applications and everyone's connected, but those could be also written in something like Java or C# to create those applications. So what's really different about JavaScript? So in order to build Google, I could make Google using C# if I wanted to. Synonymous with front-end dev, web app viewing on smartphones. So that's something which is also a really good reason. The reason why JavaScript is kind of so popular is nothing to do with technicality or how quick it is or the best language. Instead, the real reason is that JavaScript kind of decided to marry with web browsers. And what I mean by marry with web browsers is JavaScript, I see JavaScript everywhere. So if you look at a website, if you look at a web app, if you, for example, you have Google app on your phone, you run Google on your computer, you can even run Google on your smartwatch, or you have an Apple Watch, you can use a web browser on that. What does that mean? Well, it's kind of strange to think about, that JavaScript is the only language that will allow you to create an application once, and you can pretty much deploy it or deploy your product or your application to any device in the world, pretty much. So you want to run something on a billboard, you want to run something on your desktop, your laptop, your phone, your tablet, your smartwatch, you can use JavaScript in order to do that. So that's one of the reasons why JavaScript is so popular. And I can't necessarily do that with HTML by itself. So I can only change the colors, the animations or the looks if I use CSS. I can only change the contents of the website if I modify the HTML that I'm sending to the browser. But in order for my application to be interactive or responsive, once again, I need some form of JavaScript. So because of that huge, we have like a huge JavaScript community of support. That also means that JavaScript is constantly evolving, those yearly updates that we saw before. And also it's everywhere. And this doesn't mean that JavaScript is the most reliable language. It doesn't mean that it's the most scalable language. If you want to run a backend, you probably want most of the work to happen in the backend, but inevitably JavaScript is going to almost spread its tentacles everywhere. So whatever application you build, it's going to have some form of JavaScript, because that's the only thing that web browsers will recognize. That's the only thing which we can really use in order to make our applications interactive and responsive. So we use JavaScript, we use React to create applications just like we are today. And we're going to talk about one of the JavaScript frameworks that we can use in order to build our application, which is, of course, React. So React is one of the kings of JavaScript libraries. React is one of the kings, as in you'll find it in any company that you work in Australia or overseas. For example, if you want to work for Facebook or Google or Atlassian or Canva, no doubt they will use React or Angular at some capacity. And today we're going to try and explore some of the capabilities that React will offer to you, and something that's really simple. So don't expect that we're going to be recreating Facebook or anything like that. But these principles are things which we can use in order to build a prototype or some visualization of what we can, what we can show to, for example, in a hackathon or in a side project. Cool. That's the end of presenting stuff. I'm going to just check that we don't have any questions in the chat. We kill JavaScript. Yeah, I guess the main issue with killing JavaScript is, of course, it's really hard to make every web browser, to make every application that, since web browsers existed, JavaScript has existed. There's a question here which is saying, is React better than Angular? There's arguments for and against. Based on my experience, they're fairly similar in terms of like the learning curve. I haven't done too much work in Angular, but I understand how it works. I would say that React is perhaps, it's easy to understand, but it's also difficult to master. And there's all of these small technicalities that you'll see as we're going along as well. Cool. Hopefully you can still see my screen. And here I'm just in simple Visual Studio Code. Yeah, so I mean, the main reason why React and Angular are different is React is built by Facebook, Angular is built by Google. So Facebook, Google, technical rivals, they kind of wanted to invent their own technologies. It's kind of like, if you see Zoom, which we're currently using, other companies like Google will create Google Meet. What else? Facebook will create Facebook Rooms. We have all of these applications which are kind of mimicking each other. They serve a familiar purpose, but it's kind of a competition as to who gains the most popularity or gains the most users. Cool. So we've pretty much finished in terms of introducing what React is. We've also looked a little bit about what Node is and how we can create our React application. So what are we going to do in here? Well, if I go into the React workshop folder, Can everyone see my terminal at the moment? Do I need to increase the size? Cool. Awesome. So in order to create a brand new React application, we need two basic things. So obviously we need Node. So we remember Node, Node being Node, and create React app, which is going to create our React application, requires Node in order to install packages in order to run the backend of our React application. So we can install Node by doing sudo apt-get install Node, and of course it's Node.js because we're working in JavaScript. There's slight differences between what we would refer to as Node or Node.js, but in this instance we just need Node.js. So if you haven't installed that already, then you can install that. That should be pretty simple. Because I already have it installed, you can check that. And I'm sure most of you from other courses or things would have installed Node or maybe NPM, and that would install Node as well. So I can check the version by simply doing node-v, -v being the flag for getting the version to confirm that I have Node installed on my machine. Cool. What else? We saw before that we also need we need to use npm in order to install create React app. So once we install Node, we have this thing called the Node Package Manager, or npm for short. And we can use this in order to install a Node package, and create React app is one such instance of a Node package. So we can run npm install, and we can install it globally using the -g flag. And of course, we're installing create React app. Both of these steps will take time, installing Node and installing create React app. They'll take a bit of time. I've already got them installed for the sake of time. So once again, if I just, rather than installing it, I can check the version by doing npm create React app, being the package name, if I spell it correctly. And I can check the version again using -v. And this will spit out that I've got a version of create React app installed. Cool. So now we have Node installed. We have create React app installed within the Node Package Manager. Again, it's already installed. All of this stuff has already been done. So now all we need to do is run create React app. And create React app is another application or command, which was also created by Facebook, and it will form or create the basis or the skeleton of a React application with a default template. So what I mean by that is to create every file and install every package that we need in order to run, in order to edit a React application. We would need days or even weeks to go through every detail, but using create React app, is something which will allow us to generate all of these files. So remembering back to the video games analogy, to create a basic hello world, a basic React application, as soon as I run this, it's going to create about 185 megabytes of data. So it's going to download, it's going to install all of this stuff. It's going to take ages. So now is the really exciting part. We can execute something which we've installed in npm by using npx. And what this basically means is the X is like for execute. We're basically executing a Node package which we've previously installed. So we've installed create React app up here, and we're now going to run create React app by doing npx create React app, and we also need the name of our application. So we can call this something simple like my app. We could call it, we could give it no name, and it might give us a default name of app or something like that. But you can call it whatever you like. In today's workshop, we're kind of going to be creating like a version of YouTube, a really basic version of YouTube, but it will teach us a whole bunch of things which we'll need in order to create any React application that you want. So if I go ahead and just name this 123, it's going to start doing a whole bunch of things, and this could potentially take a few minutes in order for it to succeed. If I run that, it's going to basically, from a very high level, create a folder called 123. It's going to install all of the node packages that it needs. See here, we started installing 98 things in 16 seconds. Now we get like installing packages. This might take a few minutes, and it's installing all of these kinds of things. It's installing something called React, which we are somewhat familiar with. It's creating a React DOM and React scripts. So what it's doing is basically installing all of the things that we require to run and monitor our files so that we can render them to our browser, for example, Chrome, for example, Firefox. What else have I got here? Yeah, so the main question now is, while we're waiting for this, what are we actually going to create? Again, we're going to create basically a very simple YouTube app, and we're going to try and show a user's profile. And in this app, we're basically going to display a few things. So we're going to display a channel name or an app title, which will show the user's profile name. And we're also going to include a few video thumbnails, and maybe we'll also display how many views each video is getting. Now, this could take a really long time. I don't want to wait for it. So in classic, I don't know what you'd call it, in classic MasterChef style or something like that, I'm going to get rid of my 1, 2, 3 thing that I just spent so long creating. And I've created a fresh one under my YouTube. So essentially, because I'm using Zoom because of my connection, let's go into, where are we? Going into my YouTube. So once you finish running the React command, create React app, it will generate a bunch of these files. And we don't necessarily recognize a lot of these. There's a source folder, there's a public folder, and there's a README, there's a yarn lock. There's also what seems to be some package JSON and a bunch of node modules. So again, node modules is where it's installing a lot of the packages, which we don't necessarily need to remember. Cool. Let's quickly talk about why I'm using VS Code in the first place. So this is within VS Code. If I go and open the Explorer, if I go, I've opened my YouTube. So why am I using VS Code in the first place? Why can't I just use something like Sublime or something else? Or gedit if you're familiar with the C. What else? Cool. So I would say once you get into another workplace, VS Code is used a lot in a whole bunch of companies. It's used in the industry, and most workplaces will kind of use Visual Studio Code, or VS Code for short, as a recommended tool for building an application or doing some form of work, whether it's backend, whether it's front end. And maybe you would use some other tool, for example, like Eclipse. But Visual Studio Code would almost be installed by default. And VS Code is also written in JavaScript. So Visual Studio Code is essentially a JavaScript application. Some people say that it's Atom with colors. Yes, but you can also customize Atom to do what you want. You can also give Atom a terminal. You can give it a debug console. But you need to install all of this stuff, which VS Code, you install it, you open it out of the box, you do an unboxing. VS Code has everything that you would need out of the box in order to create all of this stuff, in order to have these icons of what different files are. And you can install a bunch of additional stuff, which will give you different syntax coloring and things like that. But there's also, it's not necessarily a technical reason, but Visual Studio Code is also one of the bigger JavaScript projects in the programming community. So VS Code was an open source project, and I believe it still is an open source project, but now it's also supported by a huge tech company in Microsoft. Cool. Let me just figure out where I'm up to. Cool. So we understand what VS Code is. Why are we using it? It gives us access to a terminal. It also gives us access to these files, which we can open by, opening the file. We can see what's in the file by just looking at it from this side. What else is VS Code used for? Well, we can do debugging. We can check output of programs. We can see if there's problems. We can also install a bunch of stuff which helps us with front end, but I won't necessarily do that now to keep it simple. So we've opened VS Code, and your Create React app should be installed in the local working directory that you just installed it. So yeah, I installed it in this folder. Let's go back one. I'm in React Workshop, which is my workspace or my folder. And within that, I have a folder called My YouTube. So that's the directory which I'm going to access in the open editor. Cool. What happens now? Well, if you ran npx create react app, it would give us a list of instructions, and it would say run yarn start, and yarn start will do something in order to generate the application onto our web browser. So what do we mean by that? Let's try and run it now. So we're running this thing called yarn. Look, without going into too much detail, I can't really tell you what yarn is without going into too much detail again. So let's just run yarn start as if we just installed this application, which we have. We wait a while. It's not really much to talk about. I guess inside of the YouTube app, we have this node modules folder. Look at all of the stuff that we've installed thanks to Create React app. We're probably not going to use a lot of this. And Google Chrome has decided to open in the background because we've run yarn start. And it's still trying to load our app. It might take a little while. Let's just leave that off in the right-hand side. Again, on the left-hand side, we have our list of all of these folders inside of node packages. So node modules. So inside of node modules, we have all of these things. Look at how useful they are. I have no idea what half of these are. We don't really care. So we have node modules. We have a public folder. The public folder looks like it's a bit normal or what we would expect. For example, we have this index.html. So this is looking a bit familiar. We also have this git ignore that was generated, a readme, and some other files which we don't necessarily need to worry about for this workshop. The main folder that we'll be working in is source. And you'll see on the right-hand side that we've now opened, the browser is open in the background, and we get the simple message. So yeah, if you wanted to end the workshop now, you can leave. We've pretty much created the React application already. If I'm working in a hackathon, look, this is my fantastic app. As you can see, we've got this animation. It's interactive. There's an animation going around. I've included some JavaScript, so I can win the hackathon with that. But we get the simple message to edit our source app.js and save to reload. So we should probably do something similar to that. So let's open app.js. And I'm also going to get rid of the terminal, but I'm going to get rid of it without actually exiting the terminal. Obviously, we still want this to be running in the background because it's what's running our React application in the browser to localhost 3000. You can change that with some configuration, but there's generally no reason to change it unless you have multiple, for example, multiple React applications running at the same time, which is highly unlikely. So here we have our default React application. What can we see here? So some of this stuff might seem really unfamiliar if you haven't seen JavaScript before, but one thing that should hopefully be familiar is something like this. So here we have a bunch of HTML, and these HTML has, for example, we have class names, we have source, we have a bunch of attributes attached to each of these HTML tags. So if we go on the right-hand side and we inspect, and we have a look at the contents of what's being rendered to our browser, this might be a bit small, so I apologize. But you can see here that we have the div class app, we have div class name app, we have app header, we have app header. So all of this stuff is being rendered to the browser. And this is basically just a normal function. So we have a render function. It's not taking in any arguments. It's not taking in any properties, but we're simply returning what is essentially a bunch of HTML. And where is this being used? Well, we can have a look again at the folder structure back here. We have this folder, this file, sorry, called index.js. If I open index.js, there's something called app, and it looks as though we're rendering this app using React DOM. Don't worry about this for now. We won't be changing any of this, but what you can tell is that we're appending it, or we're rendering it to the element root. So look here on the right-hand side, we have div ID root, and our app is being inserted within the root. So this app stuff, all of the divs, all of the header, all of the A tag and the P tag are being rendered inside of the div app. So we can see that here, we've got our image, we've got our link. If it's a bit small, I apologize. But basically, yeah, this is being rendered to the browser right now. It's asked us to modify source app.js. So that's probably something that we want to do. But first of all, what language is this? Is this HTML? It looks very similar to HTML. But can anyone have a guess as to what this language actually is? XML. So it's very close to XML. EJS. PHP. All right. So this is what we would refer to as JSX. And what we can kind of assume is that JSX is 99% the same as HTML. But there's some really small differences between JSX and HTML. At the moment, this is literally a group of HTML. We're defining all of these things the same way that we would if we were just creating a default index.html. None of this is really doing anything other than spinning the logo. It might be spinning the logo somewhere else. It's an SVG, so it's probably doing the animation in the image itself. Cool. So currently we have JSX or HTML inside of JavaScript. And that's pretty much the concept of React. So the concept of React at a simple level is combining JavaScript and HTML as a productive way to create a dynamic website. But we can do some special things in order to, for example, we want to render an image, and we want to render that image 50 times. And we have a bunch of attributes, we have a bunch of things. In order to do that, you would potentially need to copy, pretend this is my image. I know it's a div. But in order to create 50 of them, we would need to press enter a billion times in order to enter this thing. And what happens if we want to change the class name, for example? It means we have to go back and we have to change this to, for example, changing app to game. Then we go back and we have to edit all of those 50 lines that we've created before. Well, React allows us to do that much quicker, and it allows our changes to be applied much quicker than we could if we were just using default HTML or in default HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's follow what this says. It looks as though this is the line which is being printed at the end. So we can simply change this. Let's say this is the best React workshop ever. And if I save this, I'm not pressing refresh or anything on the browser. But if I wait a second, hopefully, there you go. So it's refreshed the browser, and I haven't actually refreshed the browser myself. I've just modified what's inside the P tag to a different title. So previously this was saying edit source app.js. It's not really helpful if I want to build an application to have that there. So I've changed it to something a bit more relevant. I said this is the best React workshop ever, and that's been rendered to the browser here, exactly in the same position. I haven't refreshed the browser, and while that might seem as though it's something trivial, if you are working on a front-end application, you could imagine that, I'm writing HTML, I modify something, like I modify this from a P tag to like an H1 tag, for example. And once I save this, in order to view my change, I would need to go into the browser and refresh it. And you can imagine if I was working on an application, I would be refreshing my browser like millions of times. So if you work in the industry, for example, for 30, 40 years, this point of like not having to refresh the browser, which isn't something that's offered by default HTML, CSS, JavaScript, is something that will like really help you in order to get things, to see your changes automatically. Especially when you're trying to develop for like desktop or mobile, not having to refresh all of these things is something which is really important. Obviously, as I change the size of this screen, it's also modifying some of the variables in order to make sure that they're not going outside of the screen. That's handled by our CSS. So our CSS is inside of app CSS at the moment. This works similarly to most HTML, CSS, JavaScript projects. Inside of here, there'll be a bunch of stuff which are basically some defaults. For example, all of this text is aligned to the center. So it's basically saying our class app is aligned to the center. You can see here we have our class name app. Have a bunch of other things. We don't need to worry about these. These are installed as part of the Bootstrap, which was installed by Create React App. So one of the many things that Create React App has done is it's added some CSS for us to visualize this app in a nicer format. A bit better than like your default hello world inside of an HTML. Awesome. So we have this code. We understand that this is JSX. It's not necessarily HTML, and we'll see some of the differences between JSX and HTML as we're editing this. So let's have a look here, and I'm going to delete this whole thing actually. So let's delete all of this, and actually we'll keep our app, but we're going to delete the header part. So if I delete the header part, let's see what happens. I've now got a blank screen. So that header had a color. It was like dark blue or gray. And now my app is now back to nothingness. It's just created this simple app div. And within here, we should probably re-add our title. So here I'm going to say, let's say, welcome to YouTube V2 inside of this H1 tag. Again, this is all HTML, but you'll see here, as soon as I saved it, it's come up on the right-hand side. So fantastic. We have an app title. What else can we do? We could change the name of React app. Let's not do that for now. For the sake of time, we're just going to be focusing on what's inside of our app. So we've got a bunch of other stuff inside of our app.js. So we understand that this is HTML. We're returning HTML from this render function, which is being created for us. We also have this app, this class app, which is extending from a component. And as you can see, when I highlight on that, it tells us that this component is coming from React. So a React component is essentially just a class which contains different methods that can be created and called. And so with any class, it has some compulsory methods, one of which is render. So if I create an app and it extends component and I save this, it's going to give me this error, and it's going to say that render is not a function. Why is that? Because there's no render that exists in this component, and this component always needs a render function. So we have this render function. It needs to return something, of course. It tells me your render method needs to return something. And what we're returning is JSX at the moment. So every class, every component, every React component needs a render method. That's all that we're really doing in terms of extending the React component here. And we've also gotten rid of the logo, so let's remove that from there. We've imported React, we've imported component because that's what we need in order to create a React component, of course. We've also imported the CSS. Why? Because our class name app needs the CSS. And if we included class names next to our H1 tags, we would use CSS on those class names in order to modify the appearance of some of those tags. Cool. All right, let's start off with something really simple. And this component that I'm going to write is essentially what we would call subscribers. So in YouTube, you have a profile, you have some subscribers. I have a bunch of videos that I've liked potentially. And what we're going to start off with is just creating the simple subscribers. And what we're going to essentially do is create a separate component which has a number of fans, and we're going to try and render that component within our app. So remember that this app is being rendered in the index.js. So let's go and do that. Now we have a few options in terms of adding our fan or subscriber counter inside of this app. We could go ahead and basically copy out this class app extends component. We can copy that out. It can't be the same name. See the error on the right. We can change this, of course, to something like subscriber counter. So we have a subscriber counter, and we're going to, for example, we're going to add, what can we add? We can add a simple H3 tag. And inside of this H3 tag, I'm just going to say, I have millions of subscribers. Amazing. Of course, the subscriber counter isn't actually being used. So we can simply introduce it here. So under our H1 tag, I'm going to add subscriber counter. And look, it's rendered to the right. So it's now got welcome to YouTube V2. I have millions of subscribers. Fantastic. So this isn't HTML. As you can imagine, this isn't HTML. Instead, this is a React component because we set up here class subscriber counter extends component. We're returning from the render function an H3 tag. And this is HTML, but it's also a JSX object. And this JSX object is obviously being referenced or being rendered at the point in which I include it inside of this app component. So this app component is the full view of our single page React application. We can add a bunch of components, a bunch of React components inside of our app. Let's see what's happening here. So you can technically create, cool. I think that's everything. There's a few things in the chat. What is the export default app? Essentially, in order for this app to be accessible to the index.js, remember in index.js, if we look again, we're importing app from app, and app is this thing. We're importing app from app.js. So we need to export it as though it's like a library. We're basically saying, okay, this class should be accessible from other files if they import it. So that's all the export default app is doing. Subscriber counter, of course, isn't being called within index.js. It's being called within app. So we don't need to export default subscriber counter. Does that hopefully make sense? All the JSX tags correspond to the classes you create. Yes, so these things in green, or these classes which I've created, are basically a template for a group of HTML, otherwise known as JSX. But this has to be JSX because this isn't HTML. Subscriber counter isn't an HTML tag. This is a JSX class, which is adding all of the contents from this return render inside of the class name app, which is why we can see it on the right-hand side. Doesn't it seem cumbersome because it seems everything from the HTML page is written in the JS file in React? Yes, but there are a few other reasons why we need to use React. Obviously, this is something really simple, as in we could just like do this in HTML. This isn't really React yet. We haven't really touched React other than just knowing that we've got this class which extends component. In fact, this isn't really touching React at all. And what I mean by that is in JavaScript, we have the ability to create a function, and we can do, for example, function subscriber counter. This is just a normal function in JavaScript. And of course, being a function, we should return something. If I return the same thing inside of this render function, I'm going to comment that out. I no longer have subscriber counter from down there. I add the same return statement. It succeeds. So currently, all I really have inside of this render function is something which is returning a JSX object, which is inherently just an HTML tag. So I can create a function this way. I can also create an arrow function, which we won't necessarily look at, but I can create a function rather than a React component because we're not actually using any React functionality yet. This isn't React, even though we're importing React. That's just something which is allowing us to use render inside of this component of the class app. Cool. So we can use this or we can use this. Let's say that I actually want to use the React component because we might be doing some other things which do require React, and I'll remove that old function. But you can use either method in this case because we're not using any React functionality. I'll get back to some of the questions in the chat as we're going along, but for the sake of time, I'll continue on. So we've included subscriber counter after our H1 tag. It's being displayed in the browser on the right. But actually, yeah, again, this subscriber counter isn't using React. It's only like JavaScript and JSX other than extending the component. This is just so that we have a render function. And this component which is rendering inside of the JSX is just having this render function with a return statement of an HTML tag. All right. So we could actually, hang on, let me get my bearings. Okay. So React components or functions, as we saw before, can take in a set of properties. It can take in a bunch of attributes, just like a function, and we can modify those attributes. We can display those attributes. So let's add a numFans property to our subscriber counter, or we can do something like number of subscribers. If I can spell subscribers, and let's just set that to some variable which we don't have yet. Let's set that to 0. So we're setting this attribute. This attribute, again, this isn't HTML anymore because HTML doesn't have a num subscribers attribute. This is a property which we're passing into subscriber counter. So what that means is if I go ahead inside of subscriber counter, I can find the number of subscribers from this attribute, and this attribute within the class is called props, not payment response, but props. So this .props is a bunch of objects, including this num subscribers. If I have more, then this props is going to have a large object with all of these properties inside of it. So what we're saying here is that this .props is an object, and inside of that object, we have num subscribers because num subscribers is what we passed in down at the bottom here. So rather than setting this .props, we want to get num subscribers out of this. How can we do that? Well, before we render, we want to, for example, rather than saying I have millions of subscribers, I might want to replace that with I have num subscribers. Now, of course, subscriber counter doesn't know what num subscribers is. It's giving us this error that it's not defined. That's because we haven't set a num subscribers variable to access inside of this JSX. So we can do that by doing the reverse of setting the props, and instead we're going to get num subscribers from this .props. So we can reverse this. We can go num subscribers equals this .props. And in JavaScript, we need some form of a scope or in other languages, you might be using used to setting, for example, an int or a double or a float. In this case, JavaScript has dynamic typing, so it doesn't know what this type is. But we can actually dynamically set it by just giving it a keyword such as let or const. In this case, we aren't going to modify non-subscribers. We're just going to read what it is. So it's best if we give it const. And this is saying this is a constant variable, and this constant variable isn't going to change inside of our render function. So we have this const, and this is referred to as destructuring the object. So remember that this.props is always going to be an object, and that object is going to contain the attributes which we pass to the component down here. So inside of here, we have num subscribers. We printed that I have num subscribers subscribers. So on the right-hand side, it tells us, welcome to YouTube V2, I have 0 subscribers. So that's a bit sad, but we can work on trying to change the number of subscribers we have. What can we do from here on out? Well, rather than having our num subscribers equal to 0, it might be better if we change this in such a way that we can define whether we have, for example, 0 subscribers or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. And something simple that I want to do is, rather than saying subscribers, if I set this to 1, it now says I have 1 subscribers, but that doesn't really make sense in English or in other languages. I said that I have 1 subscribers, and subscribers is plural, but I only have 1. So let's go ahead and change that. For that, I'm just going to do some quick fancy ternary function. So if num subscribers is equal to 1, then I'm going to print, what am I saying here? Num subscribers. Let me get my bearings again. Cool. Num subscribers, let's leave that. And rather than saying subscribers, I'm going to use num subscribers again. But this time I'm going to go num subscribers. If it equals 0, if it equals 1, then we're going to say that we're going to return subscribers. Subscriber, because we've only got 1. Otherwise, we're going to return subscribers. What we do here, let's separate it onto multiple lines so that everyone can see. Cool. And we missed the space character. So getting rid of the space, amazing. Cool. So now I have 1 subscriber, and if I set this to 0, it's now going to give us, I have 0 subscribers. That's great and all, but our subscriber count doesn't really change. So in order to do this, we need to create a state for our app. So currently we're passing in just this value of 0, but I kind of want to set a variable called num subscribers somewhere else in the code. So let's have a look down here at app. I am going to say inside of the render function, what can I say in here? I can say this.state, and this is the state of our component. But I can set this.state to an object containing whatever I want, the same way that we're dealing with props. State is just another object. In this context, I obviously want to have a number of subscribers, and let's set that to an initial value of 0. So I've set num subscribers to 0. And of course, in order to access num subscribers, I should go down here and I should set, this.state.num subscribers. And now, rather than setting 0 inside of the num subscribers as the attribute, I'm now saying I have 0 subscribers because it's obtaining this value from this.state. So our app, our React component has another field inside of the component called this.state. And this is something which is there as a value, as an open object for us to save the state of this component. So our app is going to recognize a value, which is num subscribers, and that's just going to be a simple integer. So this is being passed into subscriber counter. Subscriber counter is reading it in the render function, and we're printing whether we have 1 subscriber or whether we have 0 or whether we have many. What can we do now? So let me have a look here. Okay, so you want to be able to increase or decrease the number of fans, the number of subscribers we have here. At the moment, we have to change this every single time, and we don't necessarily want to do that. So we have the subscriber counter. That's great. That just holds our HTML tag. We also want some form of interaction with our app. And for that, we might have a subscribe button. We might have an unsubscribe button. Potentially, if you're using normal YouTube, you would have the subscribe button. And if you clicked on it again, it would unsubscribe. In this context, we have like millions of users at our fingertips, and we can subscribe to the YouTube channel as many times as we want. So let's have add remove subscriber. And we're going to extend component once again. Remember back to here, all of these components need a render function. So we're going to add a render function, and we're going to return, once again, we're going to return a bunch of JSX or HTML in this case, and we're going to have a couple of buttons. So let's add a couple of buttons. Let's add 2 buttons here. And this first button, we're going to add subscribe. And the second button, we're going to add unsubscribe. So you have 2 buttons. Fantastic. It's telling us an error. So it's saying adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. What this is saying is we can't just have a bunch of HTML without surrounding it in some kind of a div container. So this JSX is only going to render a simple HTML tag. For example, this just has 1 HTML tag, or down here, we had to wrap it in a div. We had to wrap it in a div called class name app. So inside of here, we need some form of a div, and we can just set it as an empty div if we want to. We can set it as an empty div, and surprise, it gets rid of our error. Now, our add remove subscriber isn't being used anywhere, so we should probably go down here, and we should probably add that component here. So we've got add remove subscriber. And now look what happens on the right-hand side. So we have our 2 buttons. Once again, this is just a new component that we've created. It's simply a div with 2 buttons inside, but these buttons don't do anything at the moment. So I can't subscribe, I can't unsubscribe. What can we do about that? Well, does anyone remember what we can use in order to add functionality to our button? There's a specific HTML attribute that we can use. Mine is red. Sorry, mine is red. I probably should have stated this before, because in my app.js, I added a simple button coloring before creating this. So there's a bunch of, like, it's just a button so that it would be in red and it would match YouTube a bit more. Peter says on click, Sam says CSS. Can you copy that? I think it will be in the code when I release it at the end. But button, we can have an on-click attribute. In HTML, we would set an attribute by having like these bracket, the quotation marks. And inside of here, what are we going to say? Inside of this, we can add an on-click attribute using HTML. However, we're using React, we're using JavaScript instead. So we've seen down below that we reference values by using the squiggly brackets, not quotation marks. So we can change this. We've now got squiggly brackets, and inside of here, what are we going to do? Well, we are going to run a function called on subscriber update. And inside of here, we're going to increment num subscribers. Now, this obviously doesn't have any clue about what num subscribers is. But if I type in num subscribers, and let's format this a bit nicer. And sorry. Cool. Cool. So we get a bunch of arrows on the right. Ignore that for now. On subscriber update is not defined, and num subscribers is not defined either. What will this do? At the moment, this will do nothing. And the reason for that is that we actually need a function which calls this function. And it's a bit weird, but in JavaScript, you remember that we have function, func, and we have a function like that with a return statement. We can define this same function by saying function, rather than saying the function keyword, we can simply say that we have a function. So we have func up here. Let's separate this out a bit. This empty function here. I can represent that function as this value or this variable called func. And that can simply be equal to a function. So these two things are exactly the same, except there's a few minor differences, which mean that we can use an arrow function here to say, for example, let's say that all this function is going to do is call func2. So we can say here func2. Now, if we had to write this in this syntax, then potentially the same thing would be doing something like func2, or even better, it would be returning func2. But this does exactly the same thing as the conventional func. This is something which is a bit more modern, and it's referenced as, it's called an arrow function because of this special arrow syntax. We give it a list of attributes, a list of properties inside of the parentheses, and we're simply calling a second function which has no properties as well. So remember the arrow function syntax. In order to return a function which is returning this function, we can simply call the arrow function, just an empty arrow function with no name, which calls on subscriber update. And of course, we want to increment num subscribers by 1 because this is our subscribe button. And we can copy this out again. Let's delete that and we'll create our unsubscribe button. So unsubscribe. Oh, I can't spell it today. Unsubscribe. And of course, rather than increasing the num subscribers by 1, we want to decrease it by 1. Cool. We're still getting a bunch of errors on the right-hand side. Why is that happening? Well, we haven't defined what onSubscriber update is, and we haven't defined what num subscribers is. So we should probably tell it what num subscribers is. So we go down here, num subscribers. Num subscribers. We give it this.state.num subscribers. Oh, I really can't spell it. Subscribers. So now it knows what num subscribers is. Of course, we need to use this syntax in order to get it from our props. So in our render function, we do that again. Now it knows what num subscriber is, but it doesn't know what onSubscriber update means. So onSubscriber update, we also need to pass in here. Now, in order to pass it, we need to give it the attribute. So what are we going to say here? Okay, so down here, we might pass in a variable which says onSubscriber update. I mean, that is what it's asking for. So let's get that formatted a bit nicely so we can see everything. We're going to pass onSubscriber update. OnSubscriber update, we need to pass it a field. What are we going to pass it? Well, for now, we're going to say that we have a function in this app called, let's call it handle subscriber update. So we have onSubscriber update, and we're passing a function which we haven't made yet, which is called handle subscriber update, which is part of this, which is our app. So we're passing handle subscriber update, which we haven't created yet. So we should probably create it. And how can we create it? Well, we know how to write a function, and render is like one such example of that. So let's write handle subscriber update. So we handle subscriber update. We need to give it some value. In this case, it makes sense for it to have num subscribers. So let's imagine handle subscriber update. It knows what num subscribers is. All we want to do is set num subscribers to whatever we're passing in here. So remember back here, we're incrementing num subscribers by 1, and it's calling this function called onSubscriberUpdate. And here, we're telling it that onSubscriberUpdate is this.handleSubscriberUpdate. So working backwards, we're now in here. Inside of here, we simply want to set this state, rather than saying this.state equals num subscribers 0. Rather than saying that, we want to say num subscribers, this.state should be equal to num subscribers plus 1. But there's a function which we can actually call to do this for us, another thing from our React component, and it's simply called this.state set state. Now, this.set state is simply going to override this object. And the only thing we have inside this object is num subscribers, which is a property which currently has a value of 0. Rather than setting it to 0, we can set it to the new value of num subscribers. And this num subscribers, this one is referring to the one that we've passed in as an argument. So see how these two are fully highlighted? They're exactly the same value. We can do that. We need to add a semicolon there. Now, what have we got as an error now? OnSubscriberUpdate is not defined. So here we've called this.handleSubscriberUpdate, and handleSubscriberUpdate is here. Why doesn't this work? Does anyone have any ideas? We have our class app. It has a function called handleSubscriberUpdate. We're calling this.handleSubscriberUpdate, and we're giving it to add remove subscriber component. Scope, do you need the brackets, props? There's all kinds of suggestions. We could potentially try and pass this as a prop, but it's not necessarily a property, is it? It's a new function which is meant to be attached to this app. So this is a React style thing where we actually have to bind our function to the app component. How do we do that? So we can do that by writing something like handle subscriber update. So we're defining what this.handle subscriber update is because it needs it for add remove subscriber component. Inside of here, I can go this.handle subscriber update equals this.handle subscriber update again. And this time we're going to bind it with our current app component. So our current app component is referenced as this. What is this doing? Well, it's binding handle subscriber update. This.handle subscriber update is a new variable as part of our React component, which is binded to this.handle subscriber update. So this.handle subscriber update, I've created it up here. It's a function. But rather than writing this.handle subscriber bind this down here, I want it to be called multiple times for different components, so I can set it there. What else can I do here? Well, we're currently setting our state in our render function. Every time we render the component, we're going to be binding the function every single time we create a new app. Now, in this instance, we're only creating one app, so we're probably fine. That's all okay. What else can we do? What have we got up here? Okay, so up here, we said down here that we have num subscribers and on subscribe update. So of course, we should add on subscribe update. So we're destructuring this .props, which is an object, and it has num subscribers and on subscriber update, the same as the attributes which we passed in down here. What happens now is if I click subscribe or unsubscribe, it still doesn't work. Why doesn't this work? So let's think about this. Here, we're setting num subscribers to the new value. Okay, so here we can actually change this. JS, very funky language. JavaScript does really weird things. If we remove this, that is the same as saying num subscribers equals the value that we've passed in because they have the same name. So let's get rid of that. That will simplify this a bit. So if we even separate that, we've gone from num subscribers. We've changed that by just removing the value, and instead it will override it itself because we have the same name that's passed into the function as the state property that we've defined here. So when we've rendered the app where we have num subscribers set to 0, we've binded the function to it. This should work. Why doesn't it work? That is a good question. Let's try and read through what's happening here. So on subscriber update, we're incrementing num subscribers by 1. Num subscribers by 1, which means that this .state.num subscribers would be modified. What else have we got here? Let's look in the chat. Do you need to call this .num subscribers in the function? So these attributes we've already got from the props, so we don't need to do that. Are we setting num subscribers to 0 on each render? That's probably a good question. So rather than having to render it every time, a React component has another attribute called a constructor. So we have a constructor function. A constructor are things that are going to be called when we're creating an app. Now it's giving us this error. We must call super constructor this. So let's just call super, keep it happy. Cannot read num subscribers of null. So we've removed num subscribers. I've simply added this .state num subscribers when we construct our app. So rather than overriding subscribers with 0, 0, 0, 0 every time that we're re-rendering this component, then I can now click on the buttons. Still doesn't work. Why? Because our app is only being rendered once. So this still doesn't work. I'm trying to figure out why this doesn't work. Look at the problems with live demos. Let's see what I've done wrong here. I suppose in here we can simplify this by saying const num subscribers, and we can set it to this .state, same way that we do with the props. Now we can get rid of this .state, this .state. That makes things a bit simpler. Still, our buttons don't work. We haven't changed anything. Why does that happen? So I can't actually tell what I've done wrong here. F, yeah. F is probably a good response. So given num subscribers to the add remove subscriber, on subscriber update, handle subscriber update, which means that we're basically giving it this access to this function, which would set the state of num subscribers. And of course, num subscribers was initialized to 0 there. We're incrementing num subscribers by 1. We're decreasing it by 1 here. Why doesn't this work? Well, I think I figured it out, but it could just be as simple as making that a capital letter. Yes. Okay. So again, before when I was demonstrating the HTML attribute, you have onClick. Okay, let's imagine we have an onClick attribute. We have onClick equals, and then you call some function. So you're calling like onSubscriberUpdate. This is how you would usually do it in HTML. So we do something like that. In JSX, we have special syntax, we have special attributes, and the way that they're called are different. So rather than doing this, we have to do something like this. It's more heavily linked to JavaScript. And basically what this is saying is we have an onClick attribute. We're calling the onSubscriberUpdate function. I don't need the old HTML syntax. And that capitalization is very important. As you can tell here, if I have 0 subscribers, I can subscribe. I can click that multiple times. It increments the number of subscribers, and I can unsubscribe. In fact, I can go into the negatives. Maybe that's something that we can fix. Maybe it's just a small bug that we'll include in our app. Does anyone have any questions about the add remove subscriber component or what we've done there? Yeah, 10% writing code, 90% wondering what went wrong. If we needed to, we could, of course, inspect this element and check whether it has the onClick attribute. Now, this is a bit hard to see, but you see here, it doesn't have an onClick attribute. So in the HTML that's rendered, we wouldn't actually be able to find if it had an onClick attribute. But we know that it works because if I click on the button, it does something. And here I've said it's got an onClick attribute. But in the web browser, it doesn't know what onClick attribute does, because onClick attribute is this anonymous function, which is calling onSubscriberUpdate, which is calling handleSubscriberUpdate, which is calling setState on the number of subscribers that we have for this app. Cool. Well, we finally got that to work, and we have our subscriber counter. We can say how many subscribers we have. We can subscribe or unsubscribe to our channel. Fantastic. We've now added a bit of interactivity. What else can we do? So maybe to make things a bit more interesting, let's make an even simpler component down below. So we have our number of subscribers. What else do we want in our YouTube app? We probably want some, maybe some video thumbnails of like popular videos that we've liked. And we also want to show the number of views that they have, and a title and a little like image thumbnail, which we can write. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's write a new component. We're going to call video thumbnail. And just like I said, we're going to have a title for our video. Title. Cool. We have a title. We have, what else? A thumbnail. And we also have, what else do we have? Let's say we have number of views. So I might include views with the title. Great. And that's our new component. So we've got this video thumbnail, got a title, a views, and a thumbnail. For now, let's set these titles. So maybe something that would be popular is, or maybe with like even 1511 students, we might have a video with Mark Chi, for example. And we might say, this video might be welcome to Comp 1511. Excellent. Now let's format this so everyone can see these 3 attributes: a basic HTML, a basic React component, which has a title, a number of views, and a thumbnail. Now, we can set this number of views. Let's say that, normal Comp 1511 might have maybe 1,000 views. Let's give Mark Chi 1,000 views. We also need a thumbnail. Lucky for us, I did add a bunch of little images. So let's go, ignore this for a second. I'm going to add, a few spoilers there. I'm going to add a few images, and Kermit the Frog is there. Excellent. what I was going to say is we have Mark G. So here's Mark G. Here's his profile picture. And that's going to act as our new thumbnail for the video. So we can access this by doing markg.jpg. That's the name of the file. We can go import markg.jpg and we should give it the quotes the same way that we've got the other things. And things like app.css, they're accessing it from the current directory that we're in. So if we did markg.jpg, if we look at the folder structure from earlier, this would be looking in my YouTube and trying to find it. But what we actually want is for it to look into source. So we could write source/markg.jpg, but because we know where app.js is located, because we know that the image is located in the same directory, we can refer to it as /markg.jpg. And just like we have up here, we can give it a special name. So here we can write markg from, the same way that we've imported React from React. We want to reference this image as markg. The variable markg has been imported. So inside of here, we can add markg. And markg is what we defined at the very start up here. Cool. So we've added markg. What else can we do? Well, we should probably write this component. We have a video thumbnail. It has a title, number of views, and a thumbnail. So what can we do here? We need to create a new component, don't we? So let's go here. Let's go class. Once again, we have video thumbnail as the class which we're creating. Extends component. And we need a render function. And we need to return a bunch of HTML, CSS. I am going to return an h2 tag, so a header tag, headings tag. And we're going to pass, what are we going to pass? Well, we can pass in this.props dot, what was the name that we gave it before? This.props.title. Let's see what happens if I do that. We've now got welcome to Comp 511. So we passed it as the attribute title into the video thumbnail. We also should show the number of views. So let's show the number of views as maybe brackets, and we can insert this.props.views. Now I've got 1,000, and let's add the actual word views next to it so we know what we're referring to. Welcome to Comp 1511, 1,000 views. So fantastic. This video has 1,000 views, and the most interesting part is we can add the thumbnail. So in order to add a thumbnail, we have a source tag in HTML. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to add our source. Our source is the image which we've imported up here, and we've given it a convenient name of markg. So we can go this.props.thumbnail, remembering that before, down here, we had imported markg as our thumbnail. We'd passed it as the thumbnail variable of our props object. So we have thumbnail. What is going wrong here? Once again, we have adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So you should probably add a div around it. Just as we did up here, we have an empty div. Another option we have in JSX is something called a JSX fragment. So rather than adding a new div, like we usually would, we can simply add an empty element. And so it's like an empty element, an empty HTML tag. And this is basically a grouping of HTML elements to say, this is JSX. I'm allowing this, the contents of this to be within a div, but it's not actually a div. We're not rendering a div. We're just rendering this fragment. So we see on the right, we have markg. There's our video thumbnail, and it has a title, Welcome to Comp 1511, 1,000 views. So we're done. And we have a single video of Welcome to Comp 511. But it's not very useful to have all of these components, and they're only appearing once. So what happens if we just add like 3 markgs? So we've copied the video thumbnail 3 times. Now there's 3 videos. They're all the same, which is great. But what if we want to add other videos that are popular? I want this to be the most popular YouTube platform, I can refer to these things as completely other titles, completely other views, completely other thumbnails, and still use this other object which we've referred to back here. Why do I want to do this? Well, of course, all of these things have an h2 tag and an image in common. All of these thumbnails are going to be the same. So rather than having to create, h2 tag image, h2 tag image, and copy that out 3 times, instead, I can just copy these React components. I can copy them out 3 times, and potentially, I could even write a for loop and render video thumbnail. If I have 10 videos and those videos are being passed into this app.js, I can say for I equals 0 to I equals 10, I can render another video thumbnail, and I can call, for example, I can add video thumbnail 10 times, and that would be potentially a large component here. But rather than rendering 3 marked cheese, let's add some new videos. So let's say we have a popular YouTuber, maybe we saw before, we can use the Kermit the Frog image. So let's do Kermit the Frog, and we want this to be a really popular video. So we can do Kermit the Frog dies, and in capital letters, so it's really popular. It's updated this once again. Rather than 1,000 views, let's give this 999. Let's give it something ridiculous. So it's just under 1 million views. And rather than using the Mark G thumbnail, we're going to import Kermit the Frog. What is Kermit the Frog? Kermit the Frog is that file. So I can go here. I can go rename, for example. I can copy that. Go in here. Replace markchi.jpg with Kermit the Frog, and let's just call it Kermit. Now, rather than passing in markchi, I can pass in Kermit. Now we've got markchi and we've got Kermit, but they're not the same size. The images aren't the same size. I want them all to be the same width, the same height, and I want them to be square, the same way that markchi's image is. But Kermit isn't square. He's a bit rectangular. This image that I took isn't square. We remember that we have things like CSS, which we can use to style our images. In this case, we also have style within JSX. And this style property, we want to set the width and height. And how we can do that is we can give style an object, once again, an object. And we can say width, we want to set to, let's say 150, and height, we want to set to 150 as well. So here we have, and it's already made the change. On the right-hand side, we've got a bunch of videos. We've got Mark Chi, welcome to 1511, 1,000 views, Kermit the Frog dies, and all of these thumbnails are now the correct size. Maybe let's change this to 200 to see it a bit better. That looks all right for now. So we have our subscribers button. We have a bunch of videos at the bottom. Let's finalize this last one. We have one more video to make. This one, rather than using someone that we know or a fictional character, we'll use someone in between. So PewDiePie, probably still not as popular nowadays. Maybe he's still popular, but maybe this one's like PewDiePie goes shopping. And this video, because PewDiePie is not very popular, let's say that this one only has 14 views. We need to import PewDiePie, and we need to import PewDiePie up here as well. This one isn't a JPEG, but it's still an image file, so I can import it using this. And we're importing PewDiePie, and we're giving it the import name of PewDiePie. Excellent. So now we have 3 popular, well, PewDiePie is not very popular anymore, but we have these 3 videos, and we've created a bunch of thumbnails just by passing in all of these attributes. You can copy this component. We can change some of those values the same way that we changed the subscriber counter, including this views. So potentially the views aren't going to be static. So here we've said, comp51511 has 1,000 views. But we want it to kind of change the same way that our subscribers can increment and decrement. We want it to be interactive. We want it to do something in order to change the number of views, depending on how many people are viewing each of our videos. What can we do here? All right, this brings us to our next thing. Let me get that up. Okay, cool. So far, what have we learned? We've learned about components, we've learned about states, we've learned about class-binded methods. So class-binded methods being the class-binded methods being the handle subscriber update, which is being binded in the constructor. Hopefully this is all making sense so far. And we've got 3 video thumbnails, which are appearing as these 3 objects with our videos. Now, I'm just going to check with the chat as to what's happening. Let's see if we have any questions. Any way to include hooks? When it comes to a responsive object, where do we deal with it? In a JS or within CSS? So if you want responsiveness, you need to use JS, unless you're doing, for example, we saw the animation of the React doing the spinning, the icon was spinning. That's something which we can do in CSS. But JS is what's actually being used to render all of this. I haven't written any HTML. It's all JavaScript, and it's all JSX objects. So none of this is really HTML. And we saw that because my onClick event before on this button, if I inspect the console on this button, it doesn't have my onClick attribute. And some of these things are missing because of the way that JSX is actually rendered to the browser. So none of this is essentially HTML. I don't really get the binded method arrow syntax. I can kind of skim over that again. This is creating an anonymous function. So when we click, we're calling a function, but we can't just call onSubscriberUpdate. So let's see what happens if I go onSubscriberUpdate. I don't give it anything. This page will refresh. And it gives us this error. So it tells us that like some of these things don't make sense. I'm trying to call handle subscriber update. I'm trying to call this function, but I'm actually calling it directly. And onSubscriber update is a function which we passed into this.props. But actually, we need a function which calls that function. The reason behind that is because we're dealing with a method which is actually binded to the app. This add remove subscriber shouldn't actually be able to, call handle subscriber update itself. Instead, we're calling another function called onSubscriber update, and onSubscriber update is calling this.handle subscriber update because the app is the only thing which knows about this.handle subscriber update. So it's because of the scope of our function, which is modifying the number of subscribers, our state, that we can't just go here and say, this.handle subscriber update because add remove subscriber update doesn't know about it. What else do we have from the chat? There's a couple of messages coming through. The binded method, the reason for the binded method again is because if I didn't include this, then I click on these buttons. Actually, I don't click on these buttons, but because we're modifying this class and it's modifying it by doing the this.setState, so we're calling this.setState, this needs to be binded to the class. Handle subscriber update needs to know which app object am I modifying. And in this case, we've only got one, but it still has to modify the overall app. So we need to bind it by using the this.handle subscriber update. This.handle subscriber update is a binded method to this class. In this case, this refers to our app class. Now, if you click on it, subscribers work. Cool. Okay, so we've covered all of these things. What do we want to do? We want to kind of make it so that these views will change automatically. Maybe they're going to increase the number of views randomly, and the number of views is going to change over time. So we've covered a few of the things that React can do. We've covered a basic video thumbnail component. We've covered something which is calling a function. It's calling a binded method of onSubscriber update, which is referring to handle subscriber update. That's great and all, but React can do a lot more. What are we going to do here? Let's create another component. Now, I understand that we're creating like a few components within this app.js. You can, of course, import them from other JavaScript files. So I could reference these as separate JavaScript files for separate components and import them the same way that we're importing the JPEGs. But rather than that, we would obviously be referencing it as something like .js. That's fine in terms of if we have a larger code base, but rather than having to deal with that at the moment with this very small example, I'm just going to stick to app.js. But that's something worth noting here. Here, we're going to create a view counter. And this view counter, as you can imagine, is going to count the number of views that we're setting for each of these videos. What can we do within here? Well, for starters, okay, so that's giving us the error that it's not used. That's fine. For starters, we need a render method again. So we have a render method. That's default. That's React. React needs it. We also need to return. We need to return something. And we're going to return some JSX. What are we going to return? Let's say that we're going to return, what did we have before with the views? We had something like this.props.views, views. And actually, while I'm here, I'm going to conveniently do the destructuring again so that we get used to it. I'm going to say title, views, thumbnail equals this.props. Just because I thought of it as we were going along, we can get rid of this.props, 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 and that should fix that. Cool. Inside of this return statement, I'm going to return that same thing. What was it? An h2 tag. I'm going to return an h2 tag with the number of views. Now, we aren't actually showing this view counter. For now, I'm going to add the view counter at the top underneath the title. So let's add view counter. We're not passing anything in. And we get views. Obviously, we haven't passed in, where are we? Sorry, this.props views. We haven't passed in a number of views to this view counter yet, but we'll get there. What can we do now? Okay, so let's imagine we have a views property that's passed in to this component. Let's say that I'm actually just going to pass in the value of 0. So we have 0 views. Fantastic. React, as we've seen, has a constructor because it's a class. We also have other methods. So a few other methods, sorry, the constructor again needs super. You can ignore that for now. It's dealing with some object-oriented stuff. What have we got now? Okay, we have a few other methods that can be called in React. And I'm going to write these out in the order that they would be called. We have a component, we have component did mount. We have component will unmount. And you can also have one in between, which we're going to call tick for now. What are we going to do now? So all of these functions are part of a React component. They're part of the almost like an interface where we have these functions defined, and they'll be called at certain stages where we're rendering our view counter. So the constructor, we remember, is something which is created when we create a view counter. So we created a view counter down here. As soon as we create that view counter, or even before it appears in the browser, we've used this constructor to basically do nothing at the moment. But if I do something like set state, or I initialize the state to, for example, views set to 0, then that is something which is called before we even render it to the browser. Now, component did mount is going to be called when our component is ready to be rendered to the browser. So just before we're rendering 0 views, this is going to be called. And same with component will unmount. If we decide to exit or we decide to refresh the browser, the component will unmount from the browser. Obviously, it doesn't want to stay there forever. So it's going to remove itself. And if we refresh the page, view counter would be recreated again. And we go through the same process of constructor and constructor did mount until we unmount that component again. Tick in between is something which we'll be using to basically be a function which is called over and over and over again. So our views is going to be modified so that we increment the number of views using this tick function over and over and over again. Okay, so in our constructor, we want to have a number of views. What can we do inside here? Well, down here, we can set this back to this.state.views. And here we can add this.state equals views and set that to 0. So now we have 0 views. We have this.state.views, which is getting the views attribute from the object this.state. And we've created this when we create an instance of the view counter class. What are we going to do now? So we've created the views property with an integer 0 to signify that we have 0 views initially. And what else are we going to do now? So component did mount. What can we do here? As soon as we're about to render this to the browser, we probably want to call some tick function, which is going to be called repeatedly. And using JavaScript, we have this notion of intervals or repeated functions, which can be called over and over and over again. What we're going to say here is while it's being added to the browser, to the DOM, where we haven't actually rendered anything yet, we're going to set something like this.viewsID equal to, and here we're going to call a function called setInterval. And this setInterval is going to take some function, and we're going to call that function. So we have some function there, and we're going to call that function every, say, every 500 milliseconds. So inside of this function, we can use that same arrow function syntax that we have for our on-click events. But instead here, we can call something like tick. And I've entered that in. It's given us this.tick because tick is part of the view counter. So we're calling this.tick every 500 seconds. This is being refreshed every 500 seconds. But we're not actually doing anything inside tick. So it's probably not going to do anything. What do we want to do inside of tick? Well, it's being called every 500 seconds. And we want to probably change our component state. How do we change our component state? Well, we have this.setState. And inside of this.setState, we can set, surprise, surprise, we can set views. And inside of views, we can set that to this.state.views, so our previous value of views. And we can set that to, we can increment it, and we can set it to a random integer that we make. So in JavaScript, we can use math.floor, math.random. You can ignore this for now. It's not necessary. But what we're essentially doing here is we're creating a random integer from 0 to 100. And we're going to increment it from whatever the initial views is. Now we're getting an error here because we should have a semicolon. Cool. So here we're overriding our views. You can already see on the right-hand side that we're incrementing views every 500 seconds. So we've got our new view counter. But what are we going to do with component will unmount? Well, we've set this interval. So this component is going to set this interval where it's going to tick every 500 milliseconds. But if it's going to tick every 500 milliseconds, we also need to tell it when to stop. So component will unmount. Let's say that we have, that this view counter is something which could appear or disappear. Maybe it's like part of a dropdown. If it's not necessarily rendered to the browser or we can't see it, we probably don't want it to be ticking in the background, because you imagine if I have 500 view counters, I have 500 things ticking at this 500 millisecond interval over and over and over again. So we don't want that to happen. How can we avoid that? Well, up here we've gone set interval this.tick. We can simply call something called clear interval, and we need to reference the previous interval that we've created. Lucky for us, we have this.views ID. So component will unmount when the browser refreshes, when this component is unmounted, when it disappears from the DOM, then it means that we want to clear our interval, which is the one that we initialized when we created the component or when we mounted the component to the browser. This way we won't have an interval running in the background, and we won't have our tick running over and over and over again. Cool. So now we have this fabulous incrementing views counter. It's incrementing randomly from 0 to 100 every 500 milliseconds. And obviously this is in the wrong place. We need to add it to welcome to comp 1511, Kermit the Frog dies, PewDiePie goes shopping. All three of those videos, we need to add our views counter. How can we do that? Well, we could go through here. We could modify all of the video thumbnails. We could increment, blah, blah, blah. Rather than doing that, what if I get rid of views from here? So I can get rid of views, Our video thumbnail will break because we now don't have any views here. Get rid of views. Inside of here, we have views. Again, we don't want to include that there. Rather than doing that, we can say, let's say we add it here, and we can add a view counter. So inside of our video thumbnail, we've added a view counter. And as you can see, each of these videos now have a number of views. Let's remove view counter from the top section there. So inside of our app, we have a subscriber counter. That's this section. Add remove subscriber, that's the buttons. We have 3 video thumbnails with a title and a thumbnail, which are these 3 videos thumbnails of Mark G, Kermit the Frog, and PewDiePie. Inside of our video thumbnails, which is defined here, we have a H2 tag, which has the title. We have a view counter, and we have an image with a source and a style. So now we have this incrementing views. They're all random. And as you can see, all 3 of these videos, or all 3 of these thumbnails, have a title. They have a number of views, which is incrementing, and they also have a thumbnail of each of the videos. So that's pretty much all we need to know in terms of React. So what are the basic things that we've gone through? A basic structure of a React component has a bunch of methods which are always part of a React component. We have a constructor, we have component did mount, we have tick, we have component will unmount, and we have a render. Every React component needs a render function, and that always needs to return HTML or JSX. The error messages which come from React are always going to be very helpful. They're always going to refer to what we need. And so in regards to that, we can pretty much code whatever we want to from here. We have a component did mount, we have component will unmount. We can call different functions here. For example, in your constructor, you can say, I want to grab all of this information and I want to display it in some way. You can use that by doing the set to the state variable and setting the object to whatever properties you need. For example, you might be making a YouTube app, and in this case, we have something like views. Each of these components has their own state. Each of these components has their own functions. They're all living individually of each other, but we're actually introducing these view counters separately. Notice here that I've created 3 different instances of video thumbnail, and inside of video thumbnail, I've created an instance of view counter. So now we have 3 different view counters, which is why in here, we've got 3 different views. The number of views are different amongst all 3 of these videos. Cool. I'm going to check the chat quickly. Can we change the tick per video, or is it set permanently? What do you mean by can we change the tick? So the tick was this. Yeah, so question for Sam was, what is component will unmount function doing? This is basically clearing the interval because we, for example, when the JavaScript ends, when we finish with using our app in the browser, we need a way of clearing the interval. Otherwise, we've set this interval and it's never going to end. So if I go and have food or drinks or whatever, I'll come back and it's still going to be running in the background. Cool. I think that's all I have to say. One more thing, we have this thing running. It's probably useful if I go into Babel. What is Babel? Let me just check. There should be an ability to, give me 1 second. I think I've lost it. What I'm trying to get at is all of this stuff that we've created here. If I go ahead and copy it, and maybe this is something which will work. Cool, we have a main.js. If I go ahead and create this, it won't necessarily know about the JPEG. But what I was trying to get at is, maybe if I stop sharing for a second, I'll find it. Just give me 1 second. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is, let's have a look if this works. Oh boy. Okay, I can't get it to work. But what I wanted to say is, the code that we wrote, if I share my screen again, one last time. If I share my screen again with, sure, that. What we have here is a bunch of React code, but obviously, if we think back to the presentation, anything that happens in the browser is inherently JavaScript. This file is JavaScript. And a bunch of these components, for example, our subscriber component, will literally just be calling something like react.create element. And we're creating an element which has a num subscribers. And we're basically saying, okay, I want you to create an h3 tag, and I want it to have the contents, I have num subscribers, blah, blah, blah. So when we're actually changing these files and we look in the terminal, it's doing a bunch of things. You can ignore the warning for now. But essentially what it's doing is every time I'm saving this file, it's going to compile it into JavaScript so that I can look at it in here and find that my app is running. All of this stuff is JS because JS is what can render these HTML objects which are changing. You see here that my h2 tag is constantly refreshing every 500 seconds. Maybe it's a bit small, but you see there that it's changing and my views are staying the same. All of this stuff is just HTML that was rendered by JavaScript, and we can encapsulate all of that within React in order to hold these components and use and reuse them in multiple contexts. We can repeat them. We can use them over and over again. But this is a basic app that you can use. For example, you're in a hackathon. You want to create a basic app, for example, a chatbot, or maybe you want to make a basic Instagram style of app. This is something that you can use to create it, to modify it really easily. And hopefully you've all learned something from all of this. But that's all that I have to say now. If you have any extra questions, feel free to ask them in the chat about React, internships, but I know that it's also 12 o'clock, so people are probably very hungry.
And before we all go, can we just say thanks to Nathan for running this workshop? Because it was clearly 30 if you were still here an hour over time. So great work, Nathan.
I'm sorry that it went for 2 hours instead of 1. It took longer than I expected.
Yes, I am a CSESoc leader.
Cool. Otherwise, yeah, you can ask me. Okay, so there is a question from S. My question is, what is better for building a prototype that is scalable, React or Ruby on Rails? I think the popularity of React, not necessarily for startups, but in general at companies, you'll probably find that most of them are using React. And one reason for that is potentially that React is being backed by a huge company. It's being backed by Facebook. They want to keep it up to date, and they want to be the best out there. So it's always going to be scalable in a sense. I'll upload the code to GitHub. Bear in mind that the code that I've written isn't necessarily up to scratch JavaScript. There might be, JavaScript/React. But this is just the simplest way that you can create an app from scratch using React. And of course, you can pass in things that you need. I didn't pass anything because we just wanted to create a simple app. But for example, these images or titles or things, they might be things that you want to import and create them over and over again. When running the code, do people need to download React first? How does it work if you want to launch it on a web server or something? That's also a very good question. There are some really simple resources to build your app. So before I know I'm going a bit over time, but in here, if you open your terminal, rather than running yarn start, which we did before, you can run yarn build. That will create a build in the build folder, I assume, or public. And what you can do is you can then go to something like Firebase, which is something that I did on the weekend, as Michael probably knows. You go to Firebase, and there are instructions on how to launch your app. With a React app, you don't need to do anything other than it will ask you to insert something into HTML, and you would literally go into public, go into index.html, and you'd add the lines that it requires. Can't remember exactly where it is. Yeah, so for example, some of this stuff, you can do it through here. It's relatively pain-free, and there's good tutorials on it, but I won't take up too much time here. The React app will make that a lot smoother. Tutorials of books or courses. For React, I think a lot of it will come down to you experimenting with side projects. I know for me that I didn't learn React outside of actually using it in the workplace. So, trying to create this app from scratch probably wouldn't be possible unless I knew that practical experience of this is an actual problem. I need to build an app to solve it. I need to build a front end to solve it. I can do that in order to learn React better. And things like hackathons are a good experience for dealing with that. This took me 2 minutes, not 2 minutes, 2 hours, maybe an hour to actually build. But as you can see, I could apply this to more and more cases. I could add links and things to make it an actual fully fledged app. So in the context of a 24-hour hackathon, this is something which you can use to build something which you couldn't just using HTML, CSS, JavaScript that you normally would. I think I've gone well over my allotted time. So if no one has any questions, I think that will be the end. How do you get involved in such projects? I mean, there are outlets. For example, you can look at open source projects online, but maybe they might be a bit too complex. There's also CSESoc. They have projects. Other societies would have IT projects. Almost all of them will need a website or something like that. That website is probably going to run a React and Angular, some form of front end. Cool. I think that's everything though.